I remember when I first met the human called Clint Stone. I was at the Noir slave market, paraded by my captors, who were trying to sell me for 745 marks, an insultingly low amount. I was worth at least 1,000. Anyway, I was lined up on the auction block for sale when I saw him, the man who would change my life. Step forward. The auctioneer with a deep voice and red scale skin commanded. 20 slaves stood in a line facing a large crowd. No 3 slaves were alike. There was a tall, thin Gwyn who looked like he could use a few meals. At the end there were 2 synths, standing slouched with their tentacles twitching in anxiety. Or irritation. I was never good at reading squid faces. Scattered throughout were a variety of herd races. You know the type. Dumb, vacant faces. Can work for hours without a break. Favored labor for the fields. And there was me, of course. The handsomest, strongest, and smartest Jaheen you will ever meet. My fur was straight and clean. My claws were nice and shiny and my teeth were sharp. Yes, my right leg was crooked, but that was only because I'd broken it jumping off a roof running from the watchman after stealing a priceless jewel. That's kind of how I got put on the slave market. But enough about me, you came to hear about Clint. There was only one alien whom I did not recognize his species. He was bipedal like most races. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. Pretty standard fare for the sentients of the galaxy. Apparently that design is best biologically. Don't ask me why. I don't know. He was shaped the same as the rest of us, but he was big. I'm talking enormous here. I'm tall for my species, hell for most species, at 4'9" from toe to nose. 5 feet from the top of my head to the ground. This guy was easily a foot taller than I was. I came up to his shoulder. It wasn't just his height either, he was extremely muscular. He was... well, I don't know how to say it in your language, but the closest thing I can think of is he was built like a tree. A very large tree. He looked like he could lift me, the guy next to me, and both of our mothers with one hand. But he wasn't in chains like the rest of us. Instead, he had this little box attached to his neck. He was mostly hairless, which looked kind of odd to me, being covered entirely by fur. But I'd been out in the galaxy long enough to know that beings come in all kinds, some stranger than others. The top of his head was covered with thick black hair that continued down the side of his head until it met his chin. There were patches of dark hair over his green eyes as well. Those green orbs, which I would come to know as piercing and intimidating, were fixed in some point in the space in front of him, staring vacantly. Slave, step forward. The auctioneer commanded again, looking at me. I did as he said, walking forward to stand at the front of the platform. I stood and stared at the faces staring back at me. I vaguely heard the auctioneer describing me to my audience. My dashing good looks, my strength, my... wait, I'm not an imprudent little wench. I turned my head to look at the auctioneer, but my neck chains prevent that from happening. Sold to the Mentas in the red suit for 575 marks, cried the auctioneer. What? I'd been sold for 575 marks? This was a disgrace. I should have been worth twice as much. Bring forward the human, the auctioneer boomed, 2 of his helpers pushing the strange alien towards the front of the stage. Folks, have we got a treat for you, one of the biggest, strongest alien races out there. The humans have yet to be added to the market except for today. Taken fresh from his homeworld, this hulking specimen is a pinnacle of labor force. During tests, he demonstrated strength levels of over 9,000 Raxin. He can labor for days without tiring. That's right, days. You don't want to miss this opportunity to get your very own human slave. Completely docile due to the neural implant, he will obey every order you give him. Do I hear 1,000 marks? 1,100? 1,200? And on it went, until the numbers got so big as to be nearly unbelievable. The human eventually sold for 10,000 marks to the same Mentas who had bought me. I was outraged. I was clearly worth more than this nobody from... where was it? Earth? Yes, that's right. It was at this point I decided I wanted to escape. Clearly, this Mentas did not view me as valuable, and so he wouldn't miss me. Plus, I didn't really like the idea of doing what people told me to do for the rest of my life. I'm kind of a lone wolf, if you can't tell. I also happen to be fairly adept at picking locks. Used to be a thief by trade. One time I had to pick through... Right, I'm not supposed to talk about that. Regardless, I'm good at picking locks is what I'm trying to get at. So later that night, when it was dark out and the guards were asleep, I pulled out one of the nails in the floor and sprung myself from the iron chains. I snuck carefully past the rest of the slaves, making sure not to wake them. I didn't want to have to take care of anyone other than myself. I was almost to the door when I felt a hand on my leg. I nearly shouted with surprise, but that would have alerted the guards. Instead, I settled for a good hiss. I looked down and saw the human looking at me with dull eyes. "Help me," he said, each word sounding like he had to drag it from the bottom of an ocean to say it. His eyes flashed, and for a moment I saw the man beneath the neural implant. That single flash was enough to convince me that this human would be very valuable to have by my side. I knelt beside the man and grabbed the metal box on the back of his neck. "This is going to hurt," I warned him, and yanked. It came off with little resistance. I was surprised. Whenever I had to pull one of these things off my friends, it took much more effort and a lot more blood. This human barely had a trickle. "Thank you," the human said. His voice was quite different from before. It was solid, assured, and sounded like honey pouring over rocks. My species put a lot of emphasis on the sound of someone's voice, and I knew from the single phrase that this was one to be respected and feared. Don't ask how I knew, just know that I did. He stood rubbing his neck where the device had been. Standing this close to him made him seem even larger than he was. I had to crane my neck to see his face. It was like looking at the treetops. He looked down at me and held my brown eyes with his bright green ones. No longer dull and vacant, they were filled with life and intensity. They nearly shone in the darkness. He held his hand out to me. I took it in my paw and shook. Well, more like I placed my paw in his hand. It was so big it swallowed the whole thing. "My name is Clint Stone. I wish to thank you." Yeah. You can tell me your life story after we get away from the people who want to make us work to death, I interrupted him. "You're not going to fight them?" asked Clint in a puzzled voice. I looked at him in shock. "No, they have weapons. We don't." "We have numbers and the element of surprise on our side, and you've never seen me fight," said the human in such a matter-of-fact voice that I almost thought he meant it. "Numbers? There are only 2 of us, and they have pulse rifles. Now stop talking and let's get out of here." Clint didn't say anything. He just walked over to a sleeping slave and grabbed its chains in his hands. He gave it a sharp tug and it shattered between his fingers. I stared. No wonder they had him hooked up to a neural implant. It was the only thing that could hold him. He walked from slave to slave, breaking their chains with one swift tug. I kept glancing nervously at the door, thinking that surely someone had heard that one and would alert the guards. I shifted on my paws, but the human was done in no time. I turned to the door and started to work the nail into the lock, wriggling it back and forth, trying to spring it. I gave it a sharp turn and the nail broke off. I sighed, knowing that that would mean I would have to dig out another nail and clear out the old one before I could try and pick the lock again. I felt the presence of the rest of the slaves, awoken by the sound of the tearing metal. Clint took one look at the door and kicked it down. The door slammed into the wall opposite with a loud crash. The guards had to have heard that one. They had. A pair of them ran down the hall towards the slave pens, rifles held at the ready. They shouted at us to stop, but those who were thinking of freedom were not going to let anything as simple as a potentially fatal wound stop them. The freed slaves tried to escape down the hall, but the guards shot them. In the leg, of course. No reason to kill property. The rest of the slaves scattered, frightened by the pulse rifle and the blood. Not Clint, though. He walked down the hall, marching towards the guards. I yelled at him to stop. He was going to get himself killed, but he didn't. The guards were startled by the sight of a giant walking down the hallway towards them, and they fired. Clint ducked under the pulses and rolled towards the guards. He sprang back to his feet and sprinted at them. They seemed so surprised that they didn't fire again until Clint was close enough to touch them, and by then it was too late. Clint grabbed a hold of each of their necks and smashed their heads together. I could hear the bones break from here. Clint motioned for me to follow him down the hallway. I was too shocked by the ease with which Clint dispatched those 2 guards to follow. Perhaps he hadn't been exaggerating when he said he could have taken out the whole garrison without a problem. A noise sounded behind me and I hurried after Clint. The hallway turned into a doorway, and that doorway led to a landing pad. On that landing pad was a ship of Mentas design. I'm guessing it belonged to the same Mentas who bought me and Clint. I hesitated at the door, looking back. Clint continued without me, walking towards the ship. "You coming or what?" asked Clint. "Where are we going?" I responded.
"I don't know," the human replied. "But we've got a whole galaxy to choose from."
And from that day forward, Clint and I have traveled the stars, facing monsters you can't imagine, discovering lost civilizations, saving all manner of beings from the slave trade, getting into fights. Hell, we even got into a war once. But those are stories for another time.